Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me again as we continue our time through the Psalms. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to grab a Bible and turn to the Psalms as we will continue our time of devotion there this afternoon. We've been looking at the Psalms for quite some time now. We've spent the last 2 weeks in particular looking at the Psalms of disorientation, or the Psalms where life has gone awry, Psalms where tragedy has struck. Life has gotten us down. We feel tangled, we feel trapped, we feel stuck. We feel like there's no way out, and we are crying out to God. We're going to continue looking at the Psalms of disorientation today, but looking at them from a slightly different perspective. So not 2 weeks ago, and took some time off between the last devotional and the one before that, but 2 devotionals ago, we looked at Psalms of disorientation, but more specifically, Psalms of personal lament. Psalms such as Psalm 51, where David is crying out to God after he has committed his sin with Bathsheba and is looking for God to rescue him. Psalms such as Psalm 13, where David has clearly undergone some severe trauma. He feels as though God has left him. He's asking God, why have you left me? Why, oh God, have you abandoned and forsaken me? Why have you forgotten me? Then last week we talked about Psalms of communal lament, Psalms where all of Israel, the nation as a whole, is crying out to God because they feel that the entire community has been forsaken. They feel the entire community has been forgotten. They feel as though God has turned his back on all people, not just on them. But this week, I want to look at them from a slightly different perspective. These are still Psalms of disorientation, and while oftentimes when we think of Psalms of disorientation, we think of what's gone wrong in my life. How can I blame God? There's typically 2 parties, and that is us and God. And then sometimes there's an enemy, but our cry is almost often in the Psalms of disorientation, God, you have left us. Protect us from our enemies. Prove that you're there. Remind us of your goodness. Let us see your goodness at work. We do not see you at work in our lives right now, so show yourself. Make yourself known to us. But there are only 2 Psalms, to my knowledge, 2 that I could find, that look at it from the opposite side, where rather than us crying out to Yahweh because he has forsaken us, Yahweh speaks back and says, you, my people, have gone astray. You have left me, and you need to repent. Those 2 Psalms are Psalm chapter, or the 50th Psalm, Psalm 50, and then Psalm 81. And I want to take a moment and read Psalm 81 with you this morning. I'd encourage you to flip over and read Psalm 50 as well. Some might put Psalm 95 in this category. Most of Psalm 95 doesn't really seem to fit here. The last 4 or 5 verses do to an extent fall in line with this, but I think that Psalm 81 expresses this very well. Sing for joy to God our strength. Shout aloud to the God of Jacob. Begin the music, strike the timbrel, play the melodious harp and lyre. Sound the ram's horn at the new moon, and when the moon is full on the day of our festival. This is a decree for Israel, an ordinance of the God of Jacob. When God went out against Egypt, he established it as a statute for Joseph. I heard an unknown voice say, I removed the burden from their shoulders. Their hands were set free from the basket. In your distress you called, and I rescued you. I answered you out of a thundercloud. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Hear me, my people, and I will warn you. If you would only listen to me, Israel, you shall have no foreign god among you. You shall not worship any god other than me. I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt. Open wide your mouth, and I will fill it. But my people would not listen to me. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own devices. If my people would only listen to me, if Israel would only follow my ways, how quickly I would subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. Those who hate the Lord would cringe before him, and their punishment would last forever. But you would be fed with the finest of wheat, with honey from the rock. I would satisfy you. So again, here we see that it is a psalm of disorientation. There's clearly a tension here in the relationship, because at its core, these psalms of disorientation aren't so much just about what has gone wrong in our lives, but it's about a fracture in the relationship. Psalms of disorientation, what they're really getting at is there's been a fracture in the relationship between man and Yahweh, man and God, man and the Lord. And when we look at most psalms of disorientation, that fracture in the relationship results in us crying out to God, believing that he has left us, that he has forsaken us, that he has left us to die, that he has abandoned his creation. But then a couple of times we see the reverse. We see God's perspective when there's been a fracture in the relationship. When there's been some sort of tragedy, some sort of trial, some sort of incident that has led to a fracture in our relationship, we get to see here in Psalm 81 God's reply to that. And what we see reminds me very much of a grieving parent, a grieving mother, a grieving father, one who is crying out because they say, I just want my children to come back home. If only they knew what I would do to have them back with me. If only they knew what I could do to protect them. I could take care of their needs. I could protect them from their enemies. I could shield them from any further harm. I could shield them from the trials that are coming their way. If only they would trust me enough to come back and repent. And it's a sobering thing to see this. It's a sobering thought to see how God longs for us when we have turned our backs on him, when we have left and we have turned away. It's a sobering thought how he ends by saying, those who hate the Lord would cringe before him and their punishment would last forever. But you would be fed with the finest of wheat, with honey from the rock. I would satisfy you. God is reminding us, I know that you have left me. I know that you, my child, my people have deserted and abandoned me. But if you would just come back, you would have the finest things. You would be cared for, provided for. You wouldn't be punished. You wouldn't have to endure any more hardship, but I would care for you. I would shepherd you. I would lead you. I would provide for you. I hope that this sobering reminder of who God is an encouragement to us today. That God is not one who is looking for vengeance. God is not one who is looking to harm his children. But we see a God who hurts, a God who longs for reconnection with his people, a God who longs for commitment, a God who longs for deep, intimate relationships. And that even when sometimes disorientation for us might feel like we are in the depths, that we are suffering, we are struggling, that we serve a God who suffers with us. We serve a God who just as much as we want that relationship to be healed, he desires the same things. God does not rejoice in our suffering. God does not rejoice when our relationship with him is fractured, but instead God hurts in the ways that we do. God longs for reconciliation. And he's reaching out, hoping that it can be found. My prayer is that it can be found, and that if we are hurting, that we can reach out to him, that we can turn back towards our Creator to have the intimate relationship that both of us continue to long for.